Hello, boys and girls. Mr. Krebsbach here. Today we are going to be working on Unit 5, Module 4, Session 3, Nets and Three-Dimensional Shapes. What you are going to need for today's lesson is your math notebook and a pencil. Optional today are going to be scissors and paper. Now, please do not send a message to your teacher and tell them, Mr. K said we need scissors and paper. I don't have scissors and paper. No, this is optional. In class today, we are going to be cutting out some nets and making three-dimensional shapes. We find that when we're teaching about volume and surface area, that it's a lot easier to have a three-dimensional model to look at and to work with. We would love if you created these shapes with us today, but it is optional if you have those items at your house. Now, you can just rip out a couple pieces of paper from your math notebook. You could use a couple of loose leaf papers. You could use some scratch paper to make these, okay? Again, optional. Now, the first net that we're going to take a look at, and again, we call these nets because if you look at it, this looks exactly like a net. It's laid out flat. You might throw this in the ocean and have it go around some shrimp or fish and try to catch them. They call it a net because it is laid out flat, and we have to think about when we construct it or put it together, how would it look? Okay, now this particular net is one that you have worked with already. You've worked with this in past grades. I think a lot of you might be yelling at the screen right now, oh, I know that is a cube. Well, let's talk about how we know this, okay? So we look at this first shape and we see that they're all squares. All of these shapes are going to be congruent. Remember, congruent means same size and shape, right? Same size and shape. Okay, so all of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 shapes are congruent, so that means that it's going to have 6 faces. Okay, now when we start talking about which of these shapes are going to be parallel to one another, I look at this and I say, okay, that first dot that I put right there in the middle, that's going to be my face that sits on the ground. And I'm going to shade in here these two sides because when we create this net, both of those are going to stand straight up and the red is going to end up being parallel faces, okay? Now, I'm going to go and I'm going to take blue and I'm going to say, well, you know what else is going to be parallel? It's going to be these two blue sides because those will stand up and those will make the other two walls. They'll be opposite one another. The blue will also be parallel, all right? Now, my final, this green, my base, my bottom, and this last net or square are going to also be parallel because that's going to be like the topper on my cube. So the last green is also going to be parallel, and when I put this together, it's going to create a cube. Now, when we talked about optional, so what I would think about doing right now is I would go and I would start off with squares, right? And I would make my 5 squares all the way around that middle square, right? And those are going to have our green and our red and those blue, the top and the bottom, left and the right. And we've got to put one final square. That's going to be our topper on that cube. So I would draw that on my scratch paper. I'd go around and I would snip, 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 snip on the outside. Again, I can't cut along, so when I'm talking about the outside, I do mean all the way here. I cannot cut through my net at all, right? I can't cut through here, I can't cut through there, otherwise it will fall apart. I got to go all the way around the perimeter. And then those lines that I drew, those are going to be my edges. That's where I'll fold each one and use a little bit of tape. Ooh, I didn't mention tape or some glue to get those to stick together. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about a couple of more nets. So you can see my example up there. I've got those shaded in. The darker two pieces would end up being parallel. Those lighter shaded in would be parallel, and then the white would also be parallel, and that Z would be my topper. All right, so let's take a peek at a couple more shapes that we could create. So we've got one where this A, where we've got only two rectangles that are going to be congruent, right? I'm going to shade those in green. Right, I'm going to go to blue and I'll say, oh, those triangles look congruent as well. And then we have that rectangle piece that is going to end up being larger than the other two pieces. So I look at this and I say to myself, okay, these are going to end up being a three-dimensional shape, right? Three-dimensional. We have not talked about that. Three-dimensional means that it has height, means it has length, and it also has width. Okay? A two-dimensional shape, like we're looking at on those pages, those nets, only have length and width. We don't have height. Once we fold them and we get them put together, that's when we're going to create three-dimensional shapes. Okay? So I've got a five-sided shape for A. My E, I'm back to kind of like that first shape. I have all congruent sides, right? We are going to end up not having any parallel because that's going to end up being a triangular prism, right? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 identical triangles. We've got those fold marks, and when we create that, that's going to create that triangular pyramid. My last shape, we're going to add, my last page, excuse me, we've got a few more shapes. Okay, now we've got these prisms. Okay, and a prism, again, is going to have two bases that are the same shape, and then additional sides that are the same. So I look at C, and I have myself a triangular prism. And why is it a triangular prism? Because my bases are triangles, right? When I go and make those folds on C, there's going to be some rectangles on the sides, but it's going to be topped and bottomed by a triangle. Now B is different, right? We've got a rectangular pyramid because, or a square pyramid, sorry, because we have a square as the base, but it ends up being a pyramid because it's got those triangles that are going to come to a point at the top. Okay, now for D, we have a rectangular prism because my sides, again, are made up of those rectangles. 4 congruent sides. We've got our base, which are two squares, which are congruent, and they'll end up being parallel. What we would really like to see you do is create some of these shapes, because today's independent work, you are going to be finding surface area and volume for these shapes. So once we understand the nets and how they're created and how they're put together, that's when we can start talking about surface area. For surface area, when we are comfortable with these nets, we have to find out what the area of all of the sides are. Right? So if this were a 4 by 8, we would times that together and we would know that it's 32 square units here. So we would have 32 and 32 and 32. Well, let's say the top is a 4 by 4. That gives me 16 here and 16 there, another 32. So I have 32 times 5. So 30 times 5 is 150. 2 times 5 is 10. My surface area would be 160 square units for surface area. Now, my volume, we would end up having to say 8 times 4 times 4. That is the area that's inside. So again, our volume equals our length times width times height. 8 times 4 times 4. Now we have 32 times 4. 30 times 4 is 120. 2 times 4 is 8. That would be 128 units cubed. Because volume, we get into three-dimensional shapes. So a lot to break down here. I know that in subsequent lessons we're going to talk in more detail about surface area. We're going to talk in more detail about volume. But for today, this is what we're working on, cutting out some of these nets and understanding some of these three-dimensional shapes.